Meet Katie Johnson. She's a 34-year-old teacher who bought her dream house 3 years ago in a quiet neighborhood called Oak Valley. What made this house special wasn't just the price or the location. It was the beautiful little creek that ran right through her backyard. This wasn't just any creek. It was called Meadow Creek, and it had been flowing through this area for over 50 years. When Katie first saw the house, she fell in love with the sound of water gently flowing over the rocks. The real estate agent told her it was one of the best features of the property. "You'll love waking up to the sound of running water," he said with a big smile, and he was right. Every morning, Katie would drink her coffee on the back porch, listening to the peaceful sounds of nature. The creek wasn't very wide, maybe 3 feet across, but it was crystal clear. Small fish swam in the deeper spots, and birds would come to drink from it. It felt like having her own little piece of paradise. Katie worked hard to keep her yard nice. She planted flowers along the creek bank and made sure the area stayed clean. Sometimes after big storms, branches and leaves would fall into the water. Like any good neighbor, she would clean them out so the water could flow freely. This seemed like the normal thing to do. Her neighbors seemed nice enough when she first moved in. There was the retired couple next door who always waved hello. The family across the street had 2 young kids who loved playing in their front yard. Everything felt perfect in this small community, but there was one neighbor who stood out. Her name was Margaret Walsh, and she lived in the biggest house on the street. Margaret was in her early 50s, always dressed perfectly and seemed to know everything about everyone. She had lived in Oak Valley for over 15 years and served on the Homeowners Association board. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, was supposed to help keep the neighborhood looking nice. They made rules about things, like what color you could paint your house and how tall your grass could be. Most of the time, Katie didn't think much about it. She paid her monthly fees and followed the basic rules. Margaret, however, took the HOA very seriously. She walked around the neighborhood almost every day looking for problems. If someone's trash can was out too long, Margaret would notice. If a garden had too many weeds, she would make a mental note. Some neighbors joked that she was like the neighborhood watch, but others found her a bit too intense. Katie's first real interaction with Margaret happened on a sunny Tuesday morning, in late spring. Katie was in her backyard pulling weeds when she heard someone clearing their throat behind her. "Excuse me?" came a sharp voice. Katie turned around to see Margaret standing at the edge of her property line. She was wearing a crisp white shirt and had a clipboard in her hand. "Hi, Margaret," Katie said with a friendly smile. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Margaret didn't return the smile. Instead, she looked past Katie toward the creek. "I've been watching the water flow through your yard," she said in a serious tone. Katie felt confused. "Oh, the creek? It's lovely. Isn't it? I feel so lucky to have it." "Have you been doing work on it?" Margaret asked, making notes on her clipboard. "Work on it?" Katie repeated. "I just clean out branches and leaves sometimes. You know, basic maintenance to keep it flowing nicely." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Basic maintenance? Are you sure that's all you've done?" Katie thought for a moment. Last month, after a big storm, she had removed several large branches that had fallen across the creek. She had also cleared out some built-up leaves and debris. It was just normal cleanup that any homeowner would do. "I clean it out after storms," Katie explained. "Just removing fallen branches and stuff like that, nothing major." Margaret wrote something else on her clipboard. "I see. And did you get permission from the HOA before doing this maintenance?" "Permission?" Katie laughed, thinking Margaret was joking. "It's just cleaning up storm debris. I didn't know I needed permission for that." But Margaret wasn't joking. Her expression remained serious. Any modifications to water features require HOA approval. It's in the neighborhood covenants. Katie felt a knot forming in her stomach. "But I haven't modified anything. I've just been keeping it clean." "We'll see about that," Margaret said, turning to leave. "I'll be in touch." As Margaret walked away, Katie stood there feeling confused and worried. She had never heard of needing permission to clean debris from a natural creek. It seemed crazy, but something in Margaret's tone told her this wasn't over. 3 days later, Katie found an official-looking envelope under her front door. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a formal letter on HOA letterhead. Notice of potential violation, it read in bold letters at the top. The letter explained that a complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized modifications to natural water features on Katie's property. It stated that she had 10 days to respond to the allegations and provide documentation of any work done on or around Meadow Creek. Katie read the letter 3 times, each time becoming more upset. She hadn't done any modifications. She had simply been taking care of her property like any responsible homeowner would do. That evening, Katie called her friend Lisa, who lived in a different neighborhood but had dealt with HOA issues before. "This sounds ridiculous," Lisa said, after hearing the whole story. "You're cleaning debris from a natural creek. That's not modification, that's maintenance." "That's what I thought," Katie replied. "But this Margaret person seems to think differently." "You need to gather evidence," Lisa advised. "Take pictures of the creek, get documentation showing it's natural, maybe even find old photos from before you moved in." Katie spent the next few days doing exactly that. She took dozens of photos of the creek from every angle. She researched the neighborhood's history and found old aerial photos that clearly showed Meadow Creek flowing through the area decades before any houses were built. She also discovered something interesting. The creek wasn't just on her property. It flowed from a wooded area behind the neighborhood, through her yard, then continued through several other backyards before connecting to the main drainage system that served the whole area. When Katie looked at the path of the creek, she realized something that made her heart sink. The water flowed directly past Margaret's house. In fact, Margaret's backyard was positioned right where the creek made a sharp turn. If anything happened to disrupt the normal flow of water, Margaret's property would be one of the first to be affected. Was this really about HOA rules, Katie wondered? Or was Margaret worried about something else? Katie decided to be proactive. She researched the neighborhood covenants that Margaret had mentioned and read every single page. Nowhere could she find any rules about maintaining natural water features. There were rules about installing new ponds or fountains, but nothing about cleaning debris from existing streams. She also contacted the county office to ask about Meadow Creek. A helpful employee explained that the creek was classified as a natural drainage feature and that property owners were actually encouraged to keep it clear of debris to prevent flooding. "In fact," the county employee said, "if you don't maintain it and it causes flooding problems, you could be held responsible for damages." This gave Katie some confidence, but she was still nervous about the HOA meeting she would have to attend. She had never been involved in neighborhood politics before and wasn't sure what to expect. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center. Katie arrived a few minutes early, carrying a folder full of photos, documents, and research. She hoped this would be a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. But as she walked into the community center, she saw Margaret sitting at a table with 2 other board members. Margaret had her own thick folder and was speaking in hushed tones with the others. When she saw Katie enter, Margaret's expression became stern and businesslike. Katie suddenly realized this wasn't going to be as simple as she had hoped. Margaret had clearly spent time preparing her case, and she seemed very determined to prove that Katie had violated some rule. As other neighbors filed into the meeting, Katie felt increasingly nervous. Some people smiled and nodded at her, but others seemed to be watching her with curiosity. Word had apparently gotten around that there was some kind of dispute about the creek. The HOA president, a friendly man named Robert Chen, called the meeting to order and explained that they were there to discuss a potential violation complaint. He seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation and kept emphasizing that they just wanted to get to the facts. Margaret, however, seemed energized by the formal setting. She stood up and began presenting her case with the confidence of a lawyer in court. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we are here tonight because of serious concerns about unauthorized modifications to our neighborhood's natural features." Katie listened in amazement as Margaret described her investigation into the creek situation. According to Margaret, Katie had been systematically altering the natural flow patterns and conducting unapproved landscaping activities that could potentially affect other properties. To support her claims, Margaret showed photos she had taken of Katie cleaning debris from the creek. She pointed out areas where Katie had removed branches and cleared leaves, presenting these normal maintenance activities as evidence of rule violations. When it was Katie's turn to speak, she stood up on shaking legs and tried to explain her side of the story. She showed her research proving the creek was natural and had been there long before the neighborhood was built. She explained that she was simply doing basic maintenance to keep it flowing properly. But Margaret wasn't finished. She had prepared a detailed presentation about property values and neighborhood standards. She argued that allowing residents to make unauthorized changes to water features could set a dangerous precedent. As the meeting continued, Katie began to understand that this wasn't really about rules or regulations. This was about control and power. Margaret had found an opportunity to flex her authority, and she wasn't going to let facts get in the way of her mission. The meeting ended with the board saying they needed time to review all the information and make a decision. Katie left feeling frustrated and worried about what would happen next. Walking back to her car under the streetlights, Katie couldn't help but think about how quickly her peaceful life had been turned upside down. All she had ever wanted was to take care of her property and enjoy the natural beauty of her backyard creek. But now she was caught in a battle with a neighbor who seemed determined to make her life difficult. And unfortunately for Katie, this was just the beginning of what would become a much bigger problem than she could ever have imagined. Escalation and enforcement. 2 weeks passed after that uncomfortable HOA meeting, and Katie hoped the whole thing would just blow over. She was wrong. If anything, Margaret seemed more determined than ever to prove her point about the creek situation. Katie first noticed something was different when she saw Margaret walking around her backyard with a measuring tape and a camera. This happened on a Saturday morning while Katie was inside making breakfast. When she looked out her kitchen window, there was Margaret, right at the edge of her property line, taking detailed photos of the creek from every possible angle. Katie rushed outside, still wearing her pajamas and slippers, and, "Margaret, what are you doing?" she called out, trying to keep her voice calm. Margaret looked up from her measuring tape without any sign of embarrassment. "I'm conducting a thorough investigation for the HOA board," she said matter-of-factly. "We need proper documentation of all the changes you've made." "But I haven't made any changes," Katie protested. "I keep telling you that." Margaret ignored her and continued taking measurements. She wrote everything down in a small notebook, acting like some kind of official inspector. Katie watched in disbelief as her neighbor measured the width of the creek, the depth at various points, and even the distance between rocks. "This is ridiculous," Katie muttered, but Margaret pretended not to hear. The next day, Katie received another official letter from the HOA. This one was even more serious than the first. It announced that a formal investigation was being conducted and that Katie was required to attend a second hearing in 1 week. The letter also included something that made Katie's blood run cold. It was a list of potential violations Margaret had compiled, including unauthorized creek widening, illegal debris removal, and unapproved landscaping modifications. Each violation carried a potential fine of up to $500. Katie couldn't believe what she was reading. Creek widening? She had never widened anything. The creek was exactly the same size it had always been. And illegal debris removal? She was just cleaning up fallen branches like any normal person would do. That evening, Katie decided to talk to some of her other neighbors to see if anyone else had dealt with Margaret's aggressive HOA enforcement. She started with the retired couple next door, Bob and Helen Martinez. "Oh, Margaret," Helen said with a knowing look when Katie explained the situation. "She's been like this ever since she joined the HOA board. Last year, she tried to fine the Johnson family for having the wrong shade of white paint on their fence." "The wrong shade of white?" Katie asked in amazement. "Apparently it was supposed to be eggshell white according to the HOA rules, but they used pearl white," Bob explained. Margaret made them repaint the entire fence. Katie learned that Margaret had been involved in similar disputes with at least 6 other families in the neighborhood over the past 2 years. There was the family who got in trouble for having a vegetable garden that was supposedly too big. Another neighbor was fined for leaving their trash cans out 30 minutes too long after pickup day. "The problem is, most people just give in to avoid the hassle," Helen explained. "Margaret knows that, so she keeps pushing." But Katie also discovered something else during her conversations with neighbors. Not everyone supported Margaret's strict enforcement style. In fact, many people were getting tired of her constant complaints and investigations. "She's turned our peaceful neighborhood into some kind of police state," complained David Park, who lived 3 houses down. "I'm afraid to plant flowers in my own yard without checking the HOA handbook first." This gave Katie an idea. Maybe she wasn't as alone in this fight as she thought. The second HOA meeting was much more intense than the first. This time, Margaret came prepared with a full presentation, complete with printed photos, charts, and what she called evidence of systematic rule violations. Katie sat in the front row, nervous but determined. She had spent hours preparing her own response, gathering even more documentation about the creek's natural history and her legal right to maintain it. Margaret stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor presenting a criminal case. She had enlarged some of her photos and mounted them on poster boards. She pointed to areas where Katie had removed branches, claiming these were unauthorized modifications to natural water flow patterns. "As you can see in Exhibit A," Margaret said dramatically, pointing to a photo of Katie cleaning debris from the creek, "the defendant has been systematically altering this water feature without proper permits or HOA approval." Katie felt her face turn red. Defendant? This was an HOA meeting, not a court trial. But Margaret continued her presentation as if she were arguing a legal case. Margaret then presented what she called her most serious evidence. She had somehow obtained copies of Katie's property deed and homeowner's insurance policy. She claimed that these documents proved Katie was responsible for any damage caused by changes to the creek. "If this unauthorized modification causes flooding or other problems," Margaret declared, "it could affect property values throughout our entire neighborhood." Katie couldn't stay quiet any longer. She stood up, her hands shaking with anger and frustration. "This is completely unfair," she said, her voice louder than she intended. "I haven't modified anything. I've been maintaining a natural creek that's been there for 50 years. Margaret is making this sound like I built a dam or changed the course of a river." Margaret's response was swift and cold. "The evidence speaks for itself. Rules are rules, and they apply to everyone equally." Robert Chen, the HOA president, tried to keep things calm. He seemed uncomfortable with how aggressive the whole situation had become. "Let's just review all the facts carefully," he said diplomatically. But Margaret wasn't interested in diplomacy. She had clearly convinced the other 2 board members that Katie was some kind of rule-breaking troublemaker who needed to be stopped. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. Katie presented her research showing that the creek was natural and that her maintenance was not only appropriate but necessary. She showed photos from the county records office proving the creek existed decades before the neighborhood was built. Margaret, however, had an answer for everything. When Katie showed proof that the creek was natural, Margaret argued that it didn't matter. Any work on it still required HOA approval. When Katie explained that the county encouraged property owners to keep creeks clear of debris, Margaret claimed that county rules didn't override HOA covenants. As the meeting dragged on, Katie began to realize that facts and logic weren't going to win this battle. Margaret had made up her mind, and she had somehow convinced the other board members to support her position. The final vote was devastating. By a margin of 3-1, with only Robert voting in Katie's favor, the HOA board found her guilty of multiple violations. The punishment was harsh. Katie had 30 days to restore the creek to its original natural state or face daily fines of $200. Katie raised her hand, feeling desperate. What exactly does restore to original natural state mean? The creek is already in its natural state. Margaret's smile was cold and satisfied. That's for you to figure out. But the water flow through this neighborhood needs to be properly controlled. We can't have residents making unauthorized changes that might affect other properties. As people began filing out of the meeting, Katie felt overwhelmed and defeated. Several neighbors approached her with sympathetic words, but she barely heard them. She was focused on Margaret's parting comment about controlling water flow. Walking to her car, Katie suddenly understood what this was really about. Margaret lived downstream from her property. If anything happened to change the creek's flow, Margaret's house would be one of the first to be affected. This wasn't about HOA rules at all. This was about Margaret wanting to control what happened to the water before it reached her property. But how could Katie restore something that was already in its natural state? And what did Margaret mean about properly controlling the water flow? Over the next few days, Katie tried calling the HOA office to get clarification about what exactly she was supposed to do. The responses she got were vague and unhelpful. Follow the board's directive, she was told. Restore the natural state. Katie also tried researching her legal options. She called a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, but the consultation fee was more than she could afford on her teacher's salary. The lawyer did give her one piece of free advice that worried her. HOA boards have a lot of power. If you don't comply with their orders, they can put a lien on your house. As the 30-day deadline approached, Katie felt more and more trapped. She couldn't afford the daily fines, and she couldn't afford to fight the HOA in court. But she also couldn't figure out what she was supposed to do to satisfy Margaret's demands. Then, 2 weeks before the deadline, Margaret provided the answer in the most shocking way possible. Katie was working in her garden on a Sunday afternoon when Margaret appeared at her property line. This time, she wasn't alone. She had brought a man in a business suit who introduced himself as a contractor. "We're here to discuss your compliance options," Margaret announced with obvious satisfaction. The contractor explained that he specialized in water flow management solutions. He could build a small dam or barrier to redirect the creek's flow away from the neighborhood's main drainage system. Katie stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to block the creek?" "We want you to properly manage the water flow," Margaret corrected. "This creek has been causing concerns about potential flooding and property damage. The responsible thing to do is to redirect it." "But blocking a natural creek could cause serious flooding problems," Katie protested. "All that water has to go somewhere." Margaret's expression remained firm. "That's not our concern. Our concern is protecting the properties in this neighborhood from potential water damage caused by your unauthorized creek modifications." The contractor handed Katie an estimate for the work. The cost was nearly $8,000, money Katie definitely didn't have. "This is insane," Katie said, looking at the proposal. "You're asking me to pay thousands of dollars to block a natural creek that's been flowing here for decades." "You have 2 weeks to comply," Margaret reminded her. "After that, the daily fines begin. At $200 per day, it won't take long for the cost to exceed what this work would cost." As Margaret and the contractor walked away, Katie felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. How had cleaning a few branches out of a creek turned into this? How was she supposed to come up with $8,000? And what would happen to all that water if she actually blocked the creek? That night, Katie lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle sound of Meadow Creek flowing past her bedroom window. In 2 weeks, if Margaret got her way, that peaceful sound would be gone forever. But Katie had no idea that blocking the creek would lead to consequences, far worse than anything she could imagine. The dam and the deluge, with only 1 week left before the HOA deadline, Katie felt like she was drowning in stress. She had barely slept in days, spending every free moment trying to figure out how to handle this impossible situation. The daily fines of $200 would quickly destroy her financially, but the $8,000 cost to block the creek was money she simply didn't have. Katie had always been good with budgets. As a teacher, she had to be careful with every dollar. She had a small savings account for emergencies, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the contractor's estimate. She looked into getting a personal loan, but her modest teacher's salary meant the payments would stretch her budget to the breaking point. On Tuesday night, 3 days before the deadline, Katie made a decision that would haunt her for months to come. She called the contractor Margaret had brought to her house and agreed to hire him to build the dam. "I can't afford the full amount up front," Katie explained to the contractor, whose name was Mike Torres. "Can we work out some kind of payment plan?" Mike seemed sympathetic to her situation. He had been in the construction business for 15 years and had seen plenty of HOA disputes. "Look, I have to be honest with you," he said over the phone. I don't think blocking this creek is a good idea. That water needs somewhere to go. I know, Katie replied, feeling sick to her stomach. But I don't have any choice. If I don't do this, the HOA will fine me every single day until I lose my house. Mike was quiet for a moment. All right, I can work with you on payments, but I want you to understand the risks. When you block a natural water source, especially one that's been flowing for decades, you're asking for trouble. What kind of trouble? Katie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Flooding, mostly. All that water is going to build up behind whatever barrier we put in. During heavy rains, it could overflow and cause damage. And if the barrier fails? Mike's voice trailed off. If it fails, what happens? Then you get all that backed up water rushing out at once. It's like breaking a dam. Instead of a gentle stream, you get a flood. Katie felt her heart pounding. But Margaret says this is what the HOA requires. She says it's to protect the neighborhood from flooding. Mike laughed, but there was no humor in it. Lady, I've been doing this work for a long time. Blocking natural drainage is what causes flooding, not prevents it. But if that's what your HOA is demanding, I'll do the work. Just make sure you understand what you're getting into. The construction began on Thursday morning. Katie had to take a sick day from school because she couldn't concentrate on teaching while watching workers build what felt like a disaster waiting to happen. Mike and his two helpers worked efficiently. They built what he called a water retention structure, basically a small concrete and stone dam about 4 feet high that completely blocked the creek's natural flow. They also installed a pipe system that was supposed to redirect the water toward the main neighborhood storm drains. As Katie watched the work progress, she felt increasingly anxious. The creek that had flowed freely for decades was being trapped behind a wall. Even during the construction, water was already starting to pool behind the barrier. Is it supposed to back up like that? Katie asked Mike as they took a lunch break. He nodded grimly. That's what happens when you stop moving water. It has to go somewhere, so it builds up. The pipe system should handle normal flow, but during heavy rains, he shrugged. By Friday afternoon, the dam was complete. Katie wrote Mike a check for half the cost, with the rest to be paid in monthly installments. As his truck pulled away, Katie stood in her backyard staring at what her peaceful creek had become. Instead of flowing water and gentle sounds, there was now a concrete wall with a small pond behind it. The water looked strange and still. Nothing, like the vibrant stream that had been there just hours before. Katie felt like she had destroyed something beautiful and natural to satisfy Margaret's power trip. But Margaret was delighted. That evening, she walked over to inspect the work with obvious satisfaction. This looks very professional, she announced, examining the dam structure. This is exactly what responsible homeowners should do when dealing with potential water hazards. Katie bit her tongue to keep from arguing. The creek hadn't been a hazard. It had been a natural feature that caused no problems for anyone. But now it was gone, replaced by this artificial barrier that made her stomach turn every time she looked at it. Margaret wasn't finished with her inspection. She took several photos of the completed dam and made notes in her ever-present notebook. I'll be presenting this to the HOA board as an example of proper compliance, Margaret said proudly. Other homeowners should see how water management issues should be handled. As Margaret walked away, Katie wondered what other homeowners she was talking about. Was Margaret planning to force other people to block natural features on their properties, too? For the next few weeks, the dam seemed to work as intended. There had been a couple of light rain showers, and the backup system had handled the water flow without major problems. The small pond behind the dam grew slightly larger after each rain, but nothing that seemed dangerous. Katie tried to adjust to the change, but she missed the sound of flowing water terribly. Her morning coffee routine felt empty without the gentle babbling of the creek. Sometimes she would sit on her back porch and listen to the unnatural silence where water sounds used to be. Several neighbors commented on the change. Most were sympathetic, understanding that Katie had been forced into this situation by Margaret's unreasonable demands. It's such a shame, Helen Martinez said one afternoon as they talked over the fence. That creek was one of the nicest features in the whole neighborhood. I know, Katie replied sadly. But I didn't have any choice. Margaret, meanwhile, was busy promoting her victory. She posted on the neighborhood social media group about the successful resolution of water management concerns and praised Katie for taking responsible action to protect property values. Katie cringed reading Margaret's posts. The way Margaret told the story, you would think Katie had been grateful for the chance to spend $8,000 to destroy a natural creek. But Katie didn't want to argue publicly and make the situation worse. October arrived with typical fall weather, cooler temperatures and more frequent rain. Katie watched nervously as the pond behind her dam grew larger with each storm. The backup pipe system was handling the water, but just barely. Then came the storm that changed everything. The weather forecast on Tuesday, October 15th, called for heavy rain over the next 3 days. Katie paid closer attention than usual, worried about how her dam would handle a prolonged downpour. The rain started Wednesday morning as Katie was getting ready for school. By afternoon, it was coming down steadily. Katie stood at her classroom window during her planning period, watching water pour from the sky and thinking about her backyard. By the time she got home from work, the pond behind her dam had doubled in size. Water was backing up much further, into her yard than she had ever seen before. The pipe system was working, but it was clearly struggling to handle the volume. Katie called Mike Torres to ask if this was normal. "How much rain have you gotten?" he asked. "It's been steady all day and it's supposed to keep going through Friday." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Keep an eye on it. If the water level gets too high, that barrier might not hold." "What should I do if that happens?" "Pray," Mike said grimly, "and maybe warn your downstream neighbors." Thursday brought even heavier rain. Katie took another sick day from school because she was too worried to leave her house. She spent the day watching the water level rise behind her dam, feeling more anxious by the hour. The pond had now spread across most of her backyard. Water was lapping at the base of her back porch steps. The pipe system was completely overwhelmed, with water backing up faster than it could drain away. By Thursday evening, Katie was genuinely scared. She had never seen so much water in her yard. The dam was holding, but she could see water starting to seep around the edges of the structure. Katie called Margaret, thinking she should warn her about the situation. "The dam you made me build is being overwhelmed by the storm," Katie explained. "There's more water backed up than the system can handle." Margaret's response was dismissive. "That's why we have professional contractors do this work. I'm sure it's designed to handle normal weather conditions." "But this isn't normal weather," Katie protested. "We've had 3 days of heavy rain, and it's supposed to continue." "Well, that's not really my concern anymore," Margaret replied coolly. "The water management issue has been resolved according to HOA requirements." Katie hung up feeling frustrated and alone. Margaret had forced her to build this dam, but now, she didn't want to hear about any problems it might cause. Friday morning brought the worst rain yet. Katie woke up to the sound of water roaring past her bedroom window. Not the gentle creak sounds she remembered, but the sound of too much. Water moving too fast. She looked out her back window and gasped. The water level behind the dam had risen to within inches of the top of the barrier. The entire back half of her yard was underwater. Her garden was completely submerged, and water was starting to creep toward her house foundation. Katie grabbed her phone and called Mike Torres immediately. "The dam is about to overflow," she said, trying to keep panic out of her voice. "How high is the water?" "It's almost to the top of the barrier. Maybe 6 inches away." "You need to get out of there," Mike said urgently. "If that thing fails, you don't want to be anywhere near it." "Fails? What do you mean fails?" "When water overtops a dam like that, it can wash away the whole structure. All that backed up water will come rushing out at once. It won't be a gentle creek anymore. It'll be like a river." Katie felt cold fear wash over her. "What about the houses downstream?" "You need to warn them right now," Mike said. "This could be really bad." Katie hung up and immediately started calling her neighbors, but it was too late. As she was dialing Helen Martinez's number, she heard a sound that would stay with her forever. A deep rumbling crack, followed by the roar of rushing water. She ran to her back window and watched in horror as her dam collapsed. Months of backed up water, debris, and mud exploded through the failed barrier like a liquid avalanche. The gentle creek that had once meandered peacefully through the neighborhood had become a raging torrent, carving a new, much wider channel as it roared toward the houses downstream. And Margaret's house was directly in its path, the lawsuit and the reckoning. The sound of rushing water and Margaret's screaming will forever be burned into Katie's memory. From her back window, she watched in horror as the flood of water, mud, and debris crashed into Margaret's backyard like a brown tsunami. Margaret's house sat perfectly positioned where the creek used to make its gentle turn. But now, instead of a peaceful stream, there was a raging river carrying months of backed-up water, fallen branches, and thick mud from Katie's flooded yard. Katie grabbed her raincoat and ran outside, despite the pouring rain. She had to see if Margaret was okay, even though this whole disaster was Margaret's fault in the first place. The scene was like something from a nightmare. Water was pouring into Margaret's basement through every possible opening. Her beautiful landscaped backyard was completely destroyed, with expensive plants and decorative stones scattered everywhere by the force of the flood. Margaret stood on her back porch in her bathrobe, screaming at the water as if she could somehow make it stop. When she saw Katie approaching, her face turned red with rage. "Look what you've done," Margaret shouted over the sound of rushing water. "You've destroyed my house." Katie felt a surge of anger despite the terrible situation. "This is exactly what I warned you would happen. The contractor warned you too. You forced me to build that dam against everyone's advice. You're responsible for this," Margaret screamed back. "Your modifications caused this flooding." Katie couldn't believe what she was hearing. Even while watching her basement fill with water, Margaret was still blaming Katie for the disaster that Margaret herself had demanded. Over the next few hours, the full extent of the damage became clear. Margaret's finished basement was completely flooded with 4 feet of muddy water. Her expensive home theater system was ruined. Her treadmill and exercise equipment were underwater. The basement bathroom was filled with debris and sewage, but Margaret's house wasn't the only one affected. The flood had carved a new, much wider channel through the neighborhood. The Patel family's backyard shed was knocked off its foundation. The Rodriguez family lost their entire vegetable garden when the new creek path went right through it. The fire department and emergency crews arrived around noon on Friday. They helped pump water out of flooded basements and checked to make sure everyone was safe. Nobody was hurt, thankfully, but the property damage was extensive. Katie spent the weekend cleaning up her own yard and trying to process what had happened. The beautiful creek that had drawn her to this house was now gone forever, replaced by an ugly scar of mud and debris cutting through the neighborhood. She also spent time documenting everything. She took hundreds of photos of the damage, the failed dam, and the new creek channel. Something told her she was going to need evidence of what really happened. Katie didn't have to wait long to find out why. On Monday morning, she found an envelope from a law firm stuck to her front door. Inside was a letter that made her hands shake with shock and anger. Margaret was suing her for $75,000 in damages. The lawsuit claimed that Katie had negligently and recklessly modified natural drainage patterns, causing extensive property damage to multiple homes. According to Margaret's lawyer, Katie was responsible for all the flood damage because she had illegally altered the creek without proper permits. Katie read the legal papers 3 times, each time becoming more upset. The lawsuit made it sound like Katie had decided on her own to build a dam across the creek. There was no mention of the HOA meetings, Margaret's demands, or the fact that Katie had built the dam specifically because Margaret had forced her to do it. Katie immediately called the lawyer she had consulted months earlier. This time she didn't care about the cost. She needed legal help and she needed it fast. The lawyer, Patricia Wong, agreed to meet with Katie that afternoon. After reviewing the lawsuit and hearing Katie's story, Patricia looked both angry and amazed. "This is one of the most outrageous cases I've ever seen," Patricia said, shaking her head. "She forced you to build the dam, and now she's suing you because it failed?" "That's exactly what happened," Katie confirmed. "I have all the HOA meeting minutes, the letters, everything. I never wanted to block that creek." Patricia smiled for the first time during their meeting. "Then we have a very strong defense. In fact, We might have grounds for a counter lawsuit. Over the next few weeks, Patricia began building Katie's case. She requested copies of all HOA records, including meeting minutes, emails, and correspondence. What she found was even better than Katie had hoped. The HOA had been sloppy about keeping records, but Margaret had been very thorough about documenting her campaign against Katie. There were emails where Margaret bragged about teaching that woman a lesson. There were meeting minutes where Margaret had dismissed Katie's warnings about flooding risks. Most damaging of all, Patricia found an email Margaret had sent to another board member right after the dam was built. In it, Margaret wrote, "I finally got that creek situation under control. Now all that water will be Katie's problem instead of potentially affecting my property." This email proves she knew the dam could cause problems, Patricia explained to Katie. She didn't care about neighborhood safety. She just wanted to protect her own house, even if it meant destroying yours. But Patricia also discovered something that made the case even stronger. The county had regulations about blocking natural waterways, and the HOA had violated several of them by forcing Katie to build the dam. They had no legal authority to make you block that creek, Patricia explained. Natural drainage features are protected by county ordinances. The HOA broke the law. As Patricia investigated further, she uncovered a pattern of Margaret's abuse of HOA power. There were records of her harassing other neighbors over minor issues, forcing expensive changes to people's properties, and using her board position to settle personal grudges. Katie learned that the Johnson family had been forced to repaint their fence 3 times because Margaret kept claiming the color was wrong. The Park family had been fined repeatedly for having what Margaret called excessive outdoor decorations, which turned out to be a single garden gnome. "This woman has been terrorizing your neighborhood for years," Patricia said, after reviewing all the evidence. "And the other board members have been too intimidated to stop her." Meanwhile, Margaret's case was falling apart. Her lawyer had filed the lawsuit based only on Margaret's version of events. He apparently hadn't bothered to investigate the HOA's role in forcing the dam construction. When Patricia sent Margaret's lawyer copies of the HOA meeting minutes and emails, there was a long silence from their side. Margaret had clearly not told her lawyer the whole truth about how the dam came to be built. The county also launched its own investigation into the flooding incident. When the environmental inspector saw the failed dam and reviewed the evidence, he was furious. "This is exactly the kind of environmental damage we have regulations to prevent," he told Katie during his site visit. "Natural waterways exist for a reason. When you block them, you get exactly what happened here." The inspector's report concluded that the HOA had violated multiple county ordinances by forcing the creek blockage. The county issued fines against the HOA and personally against Margaret for her role in the environmental violation. As the legal battle continued, more neighbors began speaking up about Margaret's behavior. People who had been quietly suffering under her strict enforcement started coming forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse. David Park decided to run for the HOA board, specifically to challenge Margaret's leadership. "We need to take our neighborhood back from this bully," he announced at a packed community meeting. The meeting was unlike anything Katie had ever seen. Dozens of neighbors showed up to share stories about Margaret's unreasonable demands and excessive fines. The picture that emerged was of someone who had turned the HOA into her personal weapon against anyone who annoyed her. Robert Chen, the HOA president, looked increasingly uncomfortable as neighbor after neighbor described Margaret's behavior. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Margaret had lost all support from the community. "I think it's time for some changes to our board structure," Robert announced. "We need to review all of our recent enforcement actions and make sure we're serving the community's best interests." 2 weeks later, Margaret was removed from the HOA board by a unanimous vote of the other members. The new board immediately reversed several of her controversial decisions and apologized to the families she had harassed. But Margaret wasn't finished fighting. She continued with her lawsuit against Katie, even as her legal position became weaker by the day. Her stubbornness ended up costing her dearly. Patricia filed a counter-lawsuit against Margaret for harassment, environmental damage, and legal costs. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret had used her HOA position to force an illegal dam construction that caused extensive environmental and property damage. The final settlement was devastating for Margaret. Not only was her lawsuit against Katie dismissed, but she was found liable for all the flood damage to multiple properties. The total cost came to over $150,000. Margaret's insurance company refused to cover the claims, citing the intentional acts exclusion in her policy. They argued that Margaret had deliberately caused the environmental damage by forcing the illegal dam construction. Facing financial ruin, Margaret was forced to sell her flood-damaged house at a huge loss. She moved out of Oak Valley quietly one weekend, leaving behind a neighborhood that was finally free from her tyrannical rule. The new HOA board worked with the county to restore Meadow Creek to its natural state. They hired environmental specialists to remove all traces of the failed dam and rebuild the creek channel properly. Katie watched from her back porch as workers restored the gentle flow of water that had originally drawn her to this house. It took several months, but eventually the creek looked almost exactly like it had before Margaret's destructive interference. On a quiet Sunday morning in late spring, Katie sat on her back porch with her coffee, listening to the peaceful sound of flowing water. Birds were singing in the trees and small fish had returned to the clear stream. Her neighbor, Helen Martinez, walked over to the fence with her own cup of coffee. "It's so nice to have our creek back," Helen said with a smile. "It really is," Katie agreed. "I never thought I'd hear that sound again. And it's nice to have our neighborhood back too," Helen added. "No more walking on eggshells worrying about HOA violations." Katie nodded, thinking about everything that had happened. The whole experience had been traumatic and expensive, but it had also brought the community together in an unexpected way. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now close friends, united by their shared experience of standing up to a neighborhood bully. The creek burbled gently past Katie's window, just as it had for 50 years before Margaret tried to control it. Some things, Katie realized, are too natural and powerful to be contained by artificial barriers or unreasonable people. Nature always finds a way to flow freely, and sometimes it takes everyone else along for the ride.